Hello, everyone. Welcome back. David in History for the Ages here. So, there's a topic that I've had a few people ask me about, which is what is a blood libel? And it's actually a really important topic to understand because it's actually one of the core causes of anti Semitism throughout history. I actually have a longer video explaining all the reasons why there's so much anti Semitism, and I mention it briefly there. So, what I want to do in this short video is kind of define it, give some historic examples, and also, one of the reasons I've been motivated to make this is because there's a new form of blood libel today when people accuse Israel of specifically genocide. Not just being critical of, maybe Israel being too aggressive or some policy ideas, but straight out genocide. And I've got a lot of facts and details and, really specific research things that I've done to kind of explain why this is a dangerous idea. So I hope you kind of listen through and I'll explain it. But first, let's explain what is blood libel. So, blood libel is basically the false idea that the Jewish people murdered non Jews in order to use them as kind of for blood rituals, right? A lot of people think it started during the Middle Ages when there were stories that Jewish people would kill Christians and sacrifice Christian children during Passover, that they would use their blood for making matzah. All of that, of course, is never happened, but these were the stories that where a lot of people think that originated from the Middle Ages, and that seemed to be when it did spread a lot. However, as I did some more research, there are even times from ancient times, the Jewish people go back thousands of years. During the time of the Greek period, for example, there were stories that the Jews would kidnap Greek people or Greek foreigners. They would feed them a lot of food. They would get them really fat, and then they kill them and eat their flesh, right? All of these ideas that have just existed sadly throughout history, accusing Jewish people of things that they didn't do. So the term blood libel, the reason it has that blood word in it is because there was the story that they would use the blood of, Christians or so forth or any other group for some rituals. Okay, so then you see it throughout history. There's several other times in history you see it into the modern world. So you see it a little bit in the ancient world, the Middle Ages. And then in the modern world, in the 17th century, there's some examples in Eastern Europe. It reemerged in Damascus in 1840. I'm going to leave a link here in the description to kind of give you some more detail on when it reemerged in Damascus. But there were basically these trials that Jewish people were tortured to get confessions that they were involved in these blood libel rituals. And then, of course, it was often used by Nazi propaganda during the years prior to World War II, and it circulates a lot in the Arab world today. I mean, you oftentimes get stories that Arab babies are used for blood, for Jewish rituals. The most recent one I saw is that Israel's harvesting organs of babies and using them. All these kind of crazy stories with no evidence that they're out there. Which takes us to kind of this new form of blood libel, which I think does need to be explained clearly and objectively, which is currently in 2024, there's a war going on between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And people oftentimes, you see this on social media, they go, oh, Israel's committing genocide. Well, genocide is the attempt to wipe out an entire group of people. And this is a line that's been used even before this conflict. This is not like all of a sudden now people are accusing Israel of genocide. So you have to really dig into the details and the facts. And the fact is these. These are some really important statistics and numbers that I want to share with you. The population of the Palestinians before about 1950 was less than a million. Today in 2024, it's over 5 million. So, that's not how a genocide works. If you compare that to the Jewish people during World War II, it was about a third of the Jewish population went down as a result of the Holocaust. That's a tragic and horrific genocide. There was the targeting attempt to wipe out all the Jews. Are there going to be civilian casualties in a war? Of course, right? And so I really looked to this up, and I'm going to put some links again in the descriptions where if you don't, you could find these numbers. If you don't trust the links, you go, okay, I don't want to trust these links. Do your own research on this. But you will find this very consistently, that during this conflict in Gaza, there's about a 2-to-1 ratio of civilians killed to combatants. In other words, for every Hamas terrorist that Israel kills, there are 2 civilians killed as well. And they go, well, okay, what is that? How does that represent compared to other events? So I looked up some other wars. The Korean War, 3-1. 3 civilians killed for every combatant. The Iraq War was 4-1. World War II was about 2-1. The NATO Yugoslavia conflict was about 4-1. For every four combatants in Yugoslavia that were killed by for every one combatant that was killed in Yugoslavia by NATO during those conflicts, there were 4 civilians killed. No one uses the word genocide for any of those, right? And that's where you get into this inconsistency. Another important point is Israel tends to warn the civilians in Gaza when they're going to attack. People who do genocides don't do that. Another factor is, I think it's really important that Israel does have the ability, if they wanted to basically wipe out hundreds of thousands, of people in Gaza very quickly with their military. They don't. Instead, they literally send their own soldiers into Gaza, in foot soldiers as infantry, which is much more dangerous. They're risking their own soldiers to limit casualties there. And so I think that's important to remember as well. And it's also, on top of all of this, when you compare the ratios, Israel's dealing with a war where their enemies openly use hospitals, schools, civilians as human shields. So if anything, you would expect the ratio to even be higher than it is. When I looked it up, I was expecting it to be higher, honestly, when you're fighting an enemy that's actually using their own people as human shields. So when people say, well, okay, Israel's committing genocide, it would be like people saying during World War II that the United States committed genocide in Germany because German civilians were killed while fighting the Nazis, right? And you have accounts of, now let me say this, can you say you're too harsh as a society, you're fighting the war too harshly? Sure, look, people do that with World War II all the time. Should the atomic bomb have been used? Some people say yes, some people say no. Nobody calls it a genocide. I shouldn't say nobody, I'm sure there's a few people, but it's not a mainstream idea. Same thing with Germany. Germany was bombed tremendously, for example, by the British towards the end of World War II. And some people say, well, that was too aggressive. They didn't need to do that. Nobody calls it a genocide. And I have accounts and stories, and we could see this, where literally when Germany was being bombed, when the atomic bombs were being dropped on Japan, American soldiers were cheering even. I mean, they were openly cheering because they thought, oh, okay, we don't have to be fighting there and we might not need to die. Even with all that, even with people cheering this, no one called it genocide. So the question is, why is this happening now uniquely to the Jewish state of Israel? And it's happening by design. It is a form of propaganda to create another example of anti-Semitism against the Jewish people. And this is why I call it a form of blood libel, because it's not the technical blood libel, although there are, again, some stories that they're using blood in rituals and harvesting organs. But the term blood libel can have kind of another meaning to it when you falsely accuse somebody of doing these horrific things that simply are not true. And we see a correlation with this, where more people who chant genocide, genocide, genocide against the Jewish state of Israel, you see more anti-Semitic incidents. And I don't think it's a coincidence either that it's used specifically against the Jewish people, because historically people know the Jewish people went through the worst genocide in human history, and it also diminishes the term. Look, there are other genocides. There's the Armenian genocide, for example, during the World War II. That's a clear genocide. What happened in Rwanda during the 1990s, that was a clear genocide. And every time you use that word when it's not, it diminishes the real genocides. And perhaps that's part of the agenda as well. Regardless, I really hope people are careful about using this word. You don't throw it around. If you want to think that, maybe Israel's being too aggressive, okay, everyone can have their own opinions on that. You have to look at everything in the whole context. There's still hostages at the time I'm recording this. This has been a long fight for generations as all this is going on. I think you do need to know the entire nuanced history as to, why this is happening. That's the very idea, does Israel have a right to exist in the minds of their enemies? All of these kind of things. And I've got long lectures explaining everything from ancient times to modern times, which you could check out. But the use of the word genocide is simply factually incorrect. And I'm hoping this video is one that helps explain that to people. So thank you for listening. Hopefully it was informative. Again, I'll leave some links in the descriptions with more information. And that's it. Feel free to share this with others who need to learn about this stuff. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.